Emma stepped carefully into the bright, shining restaurant. Everything around her looked so fancy. The floor sparkled. The lights hung like little stars from the ceiling, and soft music floated in the air. She held on to her small, worn-out handbag, feeling a little out of place. People sat at round tables covered in white cloth, their plates filled with food that looked too beautiful to eat. Everyone around her was dressed in expensive clothes, wearing glittering jewelry and perfect shoes. Emma wasn't used to places like this. Her clothes were simple, a plain blue dress she had owned for years and a pair of old shoes she had cleaned carefully before coming. She didn't wear makeup, and her hair was tied back in a neat, simple bun. She knew she looked different from the other guests, but she didn't mind. She had come here for a reason. She walked up to the front desk where a young woman in a black uniform stood behind a tall counter. The woman barely looked at her, busy checking something on the screen in front of her. Emma cleared her throat gently and spoke in a soft voice. "Excuse me, could I please have a table for one?" The hostess glanced up quickly, her eyes scanning Emma from head to toe. A small, almost invisible smirk appeared on her lips. She didn't hide the fact that she thought Emma didn't belong here. "Do you have a reservation?" the hostess asked, her voice cold and a little sharp. Emma shook her head politely. "No, but I was hoping there might be a table available." The hostess sighed, pretending to check the list. Nearby, two waiters whispered to each other, their eyes flicking towards Emma. One of them chuckled under his breath. "Maybe she's here to clean up," one of them joked, barely loud enough for Emma to hear. Emma heard it, though. The word stung, but she didn't show it. She kept standing straight, holding her handbag tightly, her eyes calm and kind. She didn't want to cause any trouble. She wasn't here to fight or argue. At a table not far away, a group of well-dressed people noticed the scene. One woman with shiny earrings leaned towards her friends and made a quiet joke. They laughed together, looking right at Emma, as if she were some kind of mistake that had wandered in from the street. But Emma didn't turn around. She didn't leave. She simply stood there, waiting patiently, her heart steady. She wasn't ashamed of who she was, even in a room full of people who thought she didn't belong. Inside, she thought about the reason she came. Something special was about to happen, and she wouldn't let these stares and whispers stop her. She just needed a little patience. The hostess tapped her pen against the counter, pretending to be busy. She didn't bother hiding the way she looked at Emma, like she was a problem, not a guest. After a long pause, she spoke again. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is a very exclusive restaurant. Without a reservation, I don't think we can seat you," she said, her voice flat and cold. Emma gave a small, polite smile. "I don't mind waiting if there's a table later," she said softly. The hostess sighed, annoyed, as if Emma's simple request was too much to handle. She didn't offer to check for a table or ask her to sit down while waiting. Instead, she nodded towards a corner near the entrance. "You can wait over there, if you really want." Emma nodded, thanking her quietly, and walked to the corner. She sat down on a small bench by the window. Outside, cars passed by, and people walked on the sidewalks, busy with their evening plans. Inside, laughter and soft music filled the air. It was a world she wasn't used to, but she stayed calm. Near the entrance, two waiters stood talking. One of them pointed at Emma with his chin. "Who let her in here?" he whispered. "Beats me," the other replied. "Maybe she's lost. Look at those shoes." They laughed, shaking their heads. Another waiter joined them and, seeing Emma, raised his eyebrows. "Are we running a soup kitchen now?" he joked. They all laughed again, trying to keep their voices down, but not enough. Emma heard them. She could feel their eyes on her. Her cheeks warmed, not from shame, but from the sadness of how quickly people judged without knowing anything. She looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap, and took a deep breath. She didn't speak back. She didn't leave. She stayed, quietly waiting, her eyes calm, her heart steady. At a table nearby, the same group of well-dressed people kept watching her. One woman with perfect hair leaned in, whispering something that made the others chuckle. Another man shook his head, pretending to feel sorry. "Poor thing probably thought this was a diner," he joked. The laughter that followed was soft but sharp, cutting into the quiet space around Emma. She could hear them clearly. She could feel their glances. But Emma had learned long ago how to ignore people like this. People who thought clothes or money made someone important. People who didn't care to see the heart behind a person's face. She stayed right where she was, knowing something no one else in the room did. She wasn't here by mistake, and soon everything in this room was going to change. All she had to do was wait a little longer. The group of well-dressed people at the table couldn't stop staring at Emma. Every few seconds, their eyes flicked back to her, exchanging whispered comments that were just loud enough for her to hear. One woman with a diamond necklace leaned in close to the others, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look at her," she said, her eyes wide with fake sympathy. "She probably thought she could just walk in and get a table here. I wonder if she knows how expensive this place is." The others laughed, soft but cruel, their faces twisting into mocking smiles. They didn't try to hide their amusement, making it clear they thought Emma didn't belong. Emma sat still, not reacting, as if she hadn't even noticed the whispers. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap, and she looked out the window, watching the city lights blink in the distance. The noise and laughter around her seemed far away, like she was in a different world entirely. The hostess returned to her post, glancing at Emma with an almost dismissive look before going back to whatever was on her screen. Emma had been waiting for what felt like hours, but she didn't mind. She was used to waiting, used to people making assumptions about her. She was in no rush. The world around her felt like it was spinning faster, but she kept her calm, like the still point in a whirlwind. Then, just as she was about to stand up and leave, maybe to try another restaurant, maybe to go home, something happened. The heavy doors of the restaurant swung open, and a tall figure stepped inside, commanding attention. The room went quiet. All eyes turned towards him. He was wearing a dark suit that seemed to fit perfectly, with a crisp white shirt that gleamed under the lights. His presence was unmistakable, but what caught everyone's attention the most wasn't his appearance. It was the confidence he carried with him, like he owned the room, and perhaps in a way he did. Alexander Wright, the billionaire businessman who was known for his privacy, was standing at the entrance of the restaurant. For a moment, no one moved. People shifted in their seats, whispering in excitement and surprise. But Alexander wasn't concerned with the attention he was getting. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Emma. When he saw her, his expression softened, and he smiled. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't about Emma. They were about him. People in the room murmured to each other, speculating about why he was here, why he was looking at her. It was clear that no one expected to see someone like him here with someone like her. Alexander's steps were measured and calm as he walked toward Emma, completely ignoring the stares and whispers. When he reached her, he bent down slightly and kissed her on the cheek. Emma looked up at him with a warm, gentle smile. "Emma," he said, his voice soft and full of affection, "I'm so glad we could finally have dinner together." The room froze. Everyone was watching. It wasn't just any man who had walked in. It was the man, a billionaire, and he was here with her. Suddenly, all the mocking laughter and cruel whispers seemed distant. The room fell silent as Alexander sat down beside Emma, taking her hand in his. The people at the nearby table stared in disbelief, their eyes wide with shock. The air that had once been filled with whispers now seemed to hang heavy, as though the entire restaurant was holding its breath. The hostess, who had barely looked at Emma just moments ago, now stood frozen at her post. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted between Emma and Alexander. She had no idea what was happening, but it was clear that something big had just shifted. She had assumed Emma was nothing but a mistake in a fancy restaurant, but now she saw something completely different. The man beside her was not just any ordinary guest. He was one of the most powerful men in the city, and he was sitting with her. The group of well-dressed patrons who had been laughing at Emma just moments ago were now unnervingly quiet. The woman with the diamond necklace, who had been so quick to mock Emma, now shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She looked down at her plate, suddenly aware of how wrong she had been. She tried to keep her composure, but her nervous glances toward Alexander and Emma revealed her discomfort. Alexander didn't seem to notice or care about any of this. His attention was completely on Emma. He smiled at her with such warmth and tenderness, as though they were the only two people in the room. "I'm sorry I'm late, my love," he said, his voice low and gentle. "I didn't want you to wait alone." Emma's smile was soft and reassuring. "It's all right, Alex. I was happy to wait. I knew you'd be here soon." Their words, simple and intimate, cut through the awkward tension in the room. The people around them had no idea who Emma truly was, and now they were starting to realize just how wrong they had been in judging her. Alexander turned to the waiter who had mocked Emma earlier, his eyes cold and unflinching. "We'll need the best table in the house," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument, "and a bottle of your finest wine." The waiter, who had been so sure of himself just minutes before, stammered, nodding quickly. "Ah, yes, sir, of course." Alexander's gaze shifted back to Emma, his smile returning. "I knew you'd like this place, but next time we'll go somewhere quieter, somewhere only you and I know." Emma nodded, her eyes shining with affection. She was used to being in the background, unnoticed by most, but with Alexander by her side, she felt seen in a way that she never had before, not because of his wealth, but because of the way he saw her. The guests who had once mocked her now avoided her gaze, embarrassed by their earlier cruelty. Their laughter had turned into nervous silence. They hadn't just misjudged Emma, they had misjudged the most important thing of all, the power of kindness, of true love, and the quiet strength of a person who didn't need to show off to be worthy of respect. As Alexander and Emma continued their quiet conversation, the restaurant around them seemed to fade into the background. The whispers, the mockery, the judgment, all of it disappeared, leaving only the two of them in a world of their own. As Alexander and Emma settled into their meal, the entire atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The air, once thick with whispers and judgment, had grown heavier with curiosity. The people who had once looked down on Emma now watched them closely, trying to piece together what had just happened. Who was this woman, and how had she earned the attention of someone like Alexander Wright? The group at the nearby table, who had been the loudest in mocking Emma earlier, now sat completely still, their eyes glued to the couple. The woman with the diamond necklace who had laughed at Emma just moments ago shifted in her chair, suddenly uncomfortable. The others followed her lead, no longer talking, no longer making jokes. Their faces were a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Alexander didn't seem to notice the sudden change in the room. He was focused entirely on Emma, his gaze soft and warm as he listened to her speak. They shared quiet, tender words, and a small, genuine laugh escaped from Emma's lips. The connection between them was clear, undeniable. It wasn't about wealth or status, but something deeper, a bond that made everything else fade into the background. "You know," Alexander said, taking a sip from his wine glass, "I don't like these fancy restaurants. Too much attention, too many people." He leaned back in his chair, his voice lowered to only reach Emma's ears. "But I wanted to share this night with you. Just you." Emma smiled at him, her heart full. "I don't need all of this, Alex. I don't need the attention or the fancy places. All I need is you." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, a quiet moment that felt timeless. For a brief second, the rest of the world didn't matter. Nothing else mattered except the love they shared. Meanwhile, the hostess, who had been watching from afar, finally snapped out of her daze. She had been so sure that Emma didn't belong in this world, so certain that she was some kind of mistake. But now, as she stood there, she felt small. She had no idea who Emma was or why Alexander Wright was sitting with her, but she realized just how wrong she had been. The waiter who had been so quick to mock Emma earlier came over to their table, now acting with a level of nervousness Emma hadn't seen before. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. "Is everything to your liking, sir?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. Alexander glanced up at him, his expression calm but firm. "Yes," he replied, "but next time, I prefer a little more discretion from the staff." The waiter nodded quickly, avoiding Emma's gaze as he backed away. His arrogance had disappeared, replaced by the realization that he had just mocked someone far more important than he had ever imagined. The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't because of laughter or judgment. It was because people were thinking. They were wondering about the quiet woman who had been the subject of their whispers, and why someone like Alexander Wright had chosen to sit beside her. It wasn't about money, status, or looks. It was about something more real, something they couldn't quite understand. But Alexander and Emma, they didn't need to explain themselves. They knew the truth. As the night went on, the restaurant's atmosphere began to feel different. What had started as an uncomfortable tension was now a strange kind of silence. The same people who had once looked at Emma with judgment and mockery now stared at her with a mix of curiosity and awe. They couldn't stop wondering who she really was. Why was she sitting here, at a table with one of the most powerful men in the city? The woman with the diamond necklace, who had been the most vocal in making fun of Emma earlier, now shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her smile had disappeared, replaced by a tense look. She glanced at her friends, but no one seemed to want to speak. The laughter had faded, and the room felt heavy with the weight of realization. They had all assumed they knew Emma's story, but now they understood that they hadn't known anything at all. The group's attention was now fully focused on Alexander and Emma, who continued their quiet conversation as if nothing had changed. To them, it was just another dinner, just another evening together. But to everyone else in the room, it was much more than that. Alexander leaned in close to Emma, speaking softly. "I'm glad you agreed to come out tonight. I know you prefer simplicity, but sometimes it's nice to be seen with you, to show the world who you really are." Emma smiled gently, her eyes soft. "I don't need the world to see me, Alex. All I need is you." There was a peace in her words, a quiet confidence that made those around them feel small in comparison. Emma wasn't interested in impressing anyone, and yet she had already done what the others could never do. She had gained Alexander's respect and his love. The waiter who had been so quick to mock her earlier approached their table again. This time he was careful, almost too careful, as he set down another bottle of wine. He didn't dare make eye contact with Emma, keeping his focus strictly on Alexander. His hands trembled slightly as he uncorked the bottle, pouring a little into Alexander's glass. Alexander glanced at him for a moment, his gaze cold and steady. "Next time, we'll have someone else serve us," he said, his voice calm but firm. The waiter nodded quickly, backing away with a nervous bow. As he walked off, he glanced at Emma, but she didn't return his gaze. Instead, she reached for her glass, lifting it gently to take a sip. The room, still silent, seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just the waiter who had learned a lesson. Everyone in the room had learned something, something that had been right in front of them all along. As the night went on, the mocking whispers faded away completely. No one dared speak ill of Emma anymore. The quiet woman who had walked into the restaurant with nothing but a simple dress and a warm smile had turned the entire evening upside down. In a world where people judged others by their appearance, Emma had shown them that true worth couldn't be measured by looks or wealth. It was something much deeper. And though no one said a word, they all understood. Emma wasn't just some stranger who had wandered into the wrong place. She was someone important, someone who didn't need to prove it to anyone. Not anymore. The atmosphere in the restaurant had completely changed. The guests who had once laughed at Emma now sat quietly, their conversations reduced to whispers. Their eyes lingered on her, but this time it wasn't with mockery. They were watching her with something else, something closer to respect or maybe confusion. They had no idea who she was, but they knew she was someone important. Emma, however, seemed completely unaffected by the shift in attention. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and she certainly wasn't interested in proving anything. She simply wanted to enjoy her time with Alexander, the man who saw her for who she truly was. Alexander, on the other hand, wasn't oblivious to the stares. He knew exactly what people were thinking, but he didn't care. His eyes never left Emma as they talked, and his smile never faded. To him, the only thing that mattered was the woman sitting across from him, the woman he loved, the woman who had changed his life in ways that no one could ever understand. As they continued their meal, a sense of calm settled between them, a peaceful silence that only those who truly knew each other could share. Their conversation was quiet and intimate, but the glances from the surrounding tables grew bolder. People leaned in, trying to piece together the story of the two of them. What was the connection between Alexander Wright, one of the wealthiest men in the city, and this simple, unassuming woman? Just then, a voice cut through the air. It was the woman with the diamond necklace, the one who had mocked Emma earlier. She stood up from her table, her heels clicking sharply on the floor as she walked over to Alexander and Emma's table. The room went silent again, all eyes turning toward her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little too loud, trying to make herself heard over the stillness. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just have to ask. Who is this woman?" The question hung in the air, almost too pointed. There was no hint of warmth in her voice, just a cold curiosity, as if she were trying to confirm something she didn't believe. The entire room waited for an answer. Alexander didn't flinch. He looked up at her calmly, his expression unchanged. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is my wife." The words hit the room like a wave. Gasps rippled across the restaurant as the guests processed what he had just said. The woman with the diamond necklace stood frozen for a moment, her mouth slightly open in shock. She had expected some grand story, some explanation that would make sense of this strange pairing. But there was no grand explanation, just the simple truth. Alexander continued, his tone soft but firm. "Emma and I have been together for years. We live a quiet life, away from all of this. But tonight, I wanted to share a part of my world with her." The room was still. No one spoke for several long seconds. It was clear that everyone who had mocked Emma, who had assumed she didn't belong, was now questioning their own assumptions. What had seemed like a mistake had turned into something entirely different. Alexander and Emma were not the pair they had imagined. There was something else entirely. Emma looked up at Alexander, her eyes shining with affection. She didn't need anyone to understand her or their relationship. She knew the truth, and that was enough. The silence in the restaurant stretched on, thick and heavy. People were still processing the revelation that Alexander Wright, one of the most powerful men in the city, was married to Emma. The woman with the diamond necklace, who had been the loudest in mocking Emma earlier, stood frozen, her face a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. She had assumed that Emma was nothing more than an out-of-place guest, but now everything had changed. Alexander's gaze never wavered. His attention was fully on Emma, his hand resting gently on hers. The way he looked at her was full of quiet affection, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that they were deeply connected. The room around them seemed to fade away as they shared this moment together. "I never would have guessed," the woman with the necklace finally muttered, her voice shaky. "You look so different from what I imagined." Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at Emma, who smiled softly at the woman, unfazed by the comment. It wasn't her job to prove anything to anyone. She had learned long ago that people would always judge based on what they saw, not what they knew. "That's the thing about assumptions," Emma said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "They're almost always wrong." There was a long pause before the woman spoke again. Her voice was much softer this time, almost apologetic. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to judge you. It's just, well, I didn't know." "Most people don't," Emma replied, her eyes meeting hers with an understanding look. "But it's okay. Everyone sees what they want to see." Alexander gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his eyes warm with admiration. He knew how hard it could be to deal with people's assumptions, and he had always admired Emma for her strength in handling it with grace. She never tried to prove herself to anyone. She simply lived her truth. The woman with the diamond necklace nodded, stepping back from their table. She didn't say anything else, but the way she carried herself now was different. The mockery had faded from her posture, replaced with a quiet humility. She didn't leave immediately, but went back to her table, her friends giving her questioning looks. She didn't meet their eyes. As the evening wore on, the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm. The quiet murmurs and clinking of glasses resumed, but the energy had shifted. No one seemed to want to stare too long at Emma and Alexander anymore. They had seen something, a moment of clarity, and they now understood the truth. It wasn't about wealth or appearances. It was about something far more valuable: love, respect, and the ability to see the real person beneath the surface. Alexander turned back to Emma, a soft smile on his face. "You're incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I'm just being me," she replied with a wink. No need for anyone to understand. And with that, they returned to their quiet conversation, unaffected by the world around them. The guests at the other tables continued to steal glances, But this time, it wasn't with judgment. It was with a newfound respect. Emma and Alexander didn't need anyone's approval. They had each other. And that was more than enough.